I had built walls so high, even I couldn't see over them anymore. Love became a fairy tale I stopped believing in. Then he walked into my coffee shop, quiet, kind, and worth millions. Neither of us knew that spilled latte would change everything. My name is Maya Johnson, 34 years old, owner of a small but thriving coffee shop in downtown Atlanta that I built from nothing but pure determination and too many sleepless nights. Before I tell you how my life changed forever, make sure to like this video and subscribe to hear more incredible true stories that prove love finds us when we least expect it. I used to believe in love. The kind you see in movies where eyes meet across crowded rooms and something electric happens. The kind where someone sees all your broken pieces and thinks you're perfect anyway. That belief died 3 years ago when I found out my fiancé of 5 years had been living a double life with another woman across town. Another woman who was pregnant with his child while he was still planning our wedding with me. It wasn't just him, though. Before Marcus, there was Deshaun in college who cheated with my roommate. And before him, there was my high school sweetheart who decided I wasn't ambitious enough once he got accepted to an Ivy League school. Each heartbreak carved something out of me until there wasn't much left to give. The third time wasn't the charm, it was the final straw. My mama always said I was stubborn as a mule. After Marcus, I channeled all that stubbornness into one promise: never again. I built my life around that promise. Woke up at 4:30 every morning to prep the shop. Spent my days serving coffee with a smile that never quite reached my eyes. Came home to an apartment that was stylish but felt more like a hotel than a home. Nothing too personal. Nothing that couldn't be packed up in a few hours if needed. I had my coffee shop. I had my small circle. My sister Letitia, who lived across town with her husband and twin boys. My best friend Renee, who was constantly trying to drag me to singles events I refused to attend. And old Mr. Wilson, who lived next door and always saved me the art section of his Sunday paper. That was enough. It had to be. People would ask me all the time why someone like me was single. "You're beautiful, successful, smart. What's the problem?" they'd say. I'd smile and change the subject. "How do you explain that you've built walls so high even you can't climb them anymore? How do you tell people you'd rather live your whole life alone than hand someone else the power to destroy you again?" I became an expert at keeping men at arm's length. First dates rarely turned into seconds. The moment someone showed real interest, I'd find a reason why it wouldn't work. Too busy with the shop. Too different in our goals. Too something. The excuses were endless, and after a while, men stopped asking. My friends stopped setting me up. Even my mama stopped asking when I was going to give her grandchildren. I was fine with that. More than fine. I had created a life where I didn't need anyone. Where I controlled everything. Where no one could hurt me because no one could get close enough to try. I had stability, predictability, safety. And then one rainy Tuesday morning, a quiet man in a simple gray sweater walked into my coffee shop, ordered a plain black coffee, and accidentally knocked it all over my freshly mopped floor. I had no idea that moment would be the beginning of everything changing. No idea that the apologetic stranger with kind eyes would be the one to make me question every wall I'd so carefully built. It was a Tuesday morning in April. One of those rainy Georgia days where the humidity clings to your skin and frizzes your hair no matter how much product you use. The shop was nearly empty. Just a couple of college students typing furiously on laptops and an older woman reading a paperback in the corner. I was wiping down the counter for probably the 5th time that hour when the bell above the door jingled. He wasn't what you'd call immediately striking. Average height, broad shoulders, wearing a simple gray sweater that looked expensive in that understated way. The kind where only the fabric and fit give away its price tag. No flashy watch, no designer logos screaming for attention. Just a man who entered quietly, eyes taking in the space like he was memorizing every detail. When he approached the counter, I noticed his eyes first. Warm brown with tiny flecks of gold, they had a quietness to them. Like someone who watches more than he speaks. He ordered a black coffee, no sugar, no cream. The simplest order possible, spoken in a voice that was deep but soft around the edges. $4, I said, already reaching for a cup. That's when it happened. As I handed him his change, his fingers brushed against mine, and something like a current passed between us. He must have felt it too because he fumbled the cup, sending hot coffee splashing across the counter and onto the floor I'd just mopped. "I'm so sorry," he said immediately, already reaching for napkins. I noticed his hands, strong with neat trimmed nails, working hands despite the expensive sweater. "Don't worry about it," I replied, my voice more clipped than I intended. "Happens all the time." That was a lie. I was irritated, not just about the mess, but about that strange moment when our hands touched. The last thing I needed was some kind of physical reaction to a stranger. "Please, let me help," he insisted, already on his knees dabbing at the puddle spreading across the tile. "Sir, really, I've got it." I grabbed the mop from the back. "I'll get you another coffee." When I returned, he was still there, looking genuinely distressed about the mess. "I'm David," he said as I handed him a fresh cup. "David Winters." "Maya," I replied automatically, forgetting my rule about keeping customers at a professional distance. "Maya Johnson." He smiled then, a small, careful thing that softened his entire face. "Thank you, Maya Johnson. I promise to be more careful with this one." I expected that to be the end of it, a minor incident in an otherwise unremarkable day. But David Winters returned the next morning, and the day after that. Always around the same time, always ordering the same thing, always leaving a generous tip in the jar. He'd sit by the window, sometimes with a book, sometimes with what looked like business documents, occasionally just watching the rain or people passing by. He never tried to start a conversation beyond pleasantries, which I appreciated and found oddly disappointing at the same time. After 2 weeks of this routine, I realized I'd started looking forward to his arrivals, even adjusting my schedule to make sure I was at the counter when he came in. It bothered me that I'd noticed so many things about him. The way he always held the door for people behind him, how he knew all my employees' names after just a few visits, the fact that he drove a modest sedan rather than some flashy sports car. One morning, he arrived looking exhausted, dark circles under his eyes, his usual neat appearance slightly rumpled. Without thinking, I added a blueberry muffin to his order. "I didn't order that," he said, confusion crossing his features. "On the house," I replied, shrugging like it wasn't a big deal. "You look like you could use it." The smile he gave me then was different, wider, more genuine, catching me off guard with its warmth. "Thank you," he said simply. "It's been a rough week." That small act of kindness seemed to shift something between us. The next day, instead of taking his usual window seat, he sat at the counter, close enough to talk, close enough for me to notice the faint scent of his cologne, something subtle and earthy. "So," he began carefully, "how long have you owned this place?" And just like that, despite all my rules and walls and promises to myself, I started talking to David Winters. I told myself it was just good business to be friendly with a regular customer. I told myself I was just being polite. I told myself a lot of things to avoid admitting the truth. For the first time in 3 years, I was curious about someone. And it terrified me. That first real conversation at the counter turned into another. Then another. Days turned into weeks, and somehow David had become more than just a regular customer. I found myself sharing things with him that I hadn't told anyone, like how I'd named my coffee shop Beans and Dreams, after something my grandmother used to say about planting seeds for the future. He listened in a way that made me feel heard, not just tolerated. One particularly slow afternoon, I was wiping down tables when I noticed David staring at his laptop with a furrowed brow. "Everything okay?" I asked, surprising myself by initiating conversation. He sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Just work stress, nothing unusual." I hesitated, then slid into the chair across from him. "What exactly do you do? You're always working, but I realize I've never actually asked." David looked up, seeming almost reluctant to answer. I run a tech company. We develop software for sustainable energy systems. That sounds important, I said, genuinely impressed. It's just solving puzzles, really, finding ways to make systems more efficient. He shrugged like it was nothing, closing his laptop. What about you? Was owning a coffee shop always the dream? I laughed. Hardly. I have a business degree from Spelman. Everyone expected me to pursue corporate finance. But after my grandmother passed, I used my inheritance to buy this place. It was supposed to be temporary. But you fell in love with it, he finished for me, understanding in his eyes. I did, I admitted. There's something about creating a space where people feel welcome that fills me up inside. Our conversation meandered from work to childhood memories, from favorite books to travel dreams. Before I knew it, 3 hours had passed, and the evening shift employee was clearing her throat to let me know she'd arrived. I should let you go, David said, gathering his things. Then, after a pause that felt weighted with possibility, unless you'd like to continue this conversation somewhere else? Maybe dinner? Every alarm bell in my head started ringing. This was exactly what I'd been avoiding, crossing the line from friendly customer to something more. But instead of my usual automatic rejection, I heard myself say, I'd like that. We walked to a small Ethiopian restaurant a few blocks away. The whole time, I kept waiting for the other shoe to drop, for him to turn into someone else, someone with expectations and demands. But David remained just David. Thoughtful, attentive, gently funny in a way that surprised delighted laughs out of me. It wasn't until the bill came that I got my first real shock. The owner came to our table, greeting David with a warm embrace, refusing to let him pay. Your donation saved my sister's medical clinic back home, the owner insisted. You and your guest eat for free in my restaurant, always. David looked uncomfortable with the attention, thanking the man but insisting on leaving cash anyway. When the owner walked away, I raised an eyebrow. Donation? I asked. David shifted in his seat. It wasn't much. His sister runs a women's health clinic in Ethiopia. They needed equipment. How much is not much? I pressed, suddenly curious about this man who dressed so simply yet apparently had money to donate to international causes. 200,000, he said quietly, avoiding my eyes. Look, Maya, I don't like talking about money. $200,000? I interrupted, unable to hide my shock. Who are you, really? He looked at me then, a vulnerability in his expression I hadn't seen before. Just a guy who got lucky with the right idea at the right time. My company went public 3 years ago. The money, it's new to me too. I'm still figuring out what to do with it. On the walk back to my shop where my car was parked, I felt a strange mix of emotions. Part of me wanted to retreat. Wealthy men with power were dangerous in my experience. But another part of me was intrigued by how uncomfortable David seemed with his own success, how he carried it like a responsibility rather than a trophy. I'm sorry I didn't mention it before, he said as we reached my car. People treat you differently when they know. Like giving you free food? I teased, trying to lighten the mood. Like wanting things from you, he replied, his expression serious. Or assuming things about you that aren't true. I understood that more than he knew. How many times had people seen my guard up and assumed I was cold or difficult, rather than just protecting myself? Well, I said, unlocking my car door, for what it's worth, I liked you better when I thought you were just a guy who really loved plain black coffee. He laughed, the tension breaking. Is that so? Yes, I said firmly, because that guy seemed real. David stepped closer, his eyes searching mine. I'm still that guy, Maya. The rest is just circumstance. Standing there in the glow of the streetlight, I felt something inside me shift. Like a door long rusted shut was creaking open just a fraction. For the first time in years, I let myself consider the possibility that not every man with power would abuse it, that not every heart was waiting to betray. "Good night, David," I said, getting into my car before I could do something foolish like let him kiss me. "Good night, Maya," he replied, and the way he said my name, like it was something precious, followed me all the way home. That night, I called Renee for the first time in months just to talk about a man. As the words tumbled out, I realized with a start that my carefully constructed walls had already begun to crack. And the most terrifying part? Some small, brave piece of me was glad. After that night at the Ethiopian restaurant, something changed between David and me. What had been casual coffee counter conversations evolved into something more intentional. He started texting me throughout the day. Nothing invasive, just small thoughts that showed he was thinking of me. A photo of a dog that looked like it was smiling. A quote from a book he was reading. A sunset from his office window with the caption, "Almost as beautiful as your smile." I expected grand gestures once I knew about his wealth. Expensive jewelry, designer clothes, flashy dates. Things Marcus had used to apologize after disappearing for days. But David's gestures were different. Thoughtful rather than extravagant. Like the morning I mentioned offhandedly that I missed my grandmother's garden, especially the lavender she grew. 3 days later, he arrived with a small potted lavender plant for the windowsill in my office. "So you can have a piece of her garden with you," he said simply. Or the time he remembered I'd said my favorite childhood book was a worn copy of The Secret Garden that had been lost in a move. He didn't buy me a first edition or anything ostentatious. Instead, he found a used copy with a similar cover to the one I'd described, with notes in the margins from its previous owner. A little girl named Emma who had loved it as much as I had. "I thought you might like reading it with someone else's thoughts alongside your own," he explained. "Like sharing it with another friend." I cried that night after he left, holding that book and wondering how this man I'd known for such a short time could understand me in ways people I'd spent years with never had. My friends had opinions, of course. Renee was ecstatic when I finally agreed to a double date with her and her husband. "Girl, when you said he was wealthy, I was expecting some arrogant Wall Street type," she whispered in the bathroom after meeting him. "He's so normal. And the way he looks at you, like you hung the moon and stars." My sister Letitia was more cautious. "Just be careful," she warned during our weekly Sunday call. "Men with money are used to getting what they want, and you're just starting to put yourself back together after Marcus." "He's not like that," I defended, surprising myself with the certainty in my voice. "They never are." "At first," she replied, the skepticism clear. "Just promise me you won't rush into anything." But Letitia changed her tune when David came to my nephew's birthday party. I'd mentioned it casually, not really expecting him to be interested in a chaotic gathering of 6-year-olds. Not only did he come, but he arrived early to help set up, brought thoughtfully chosen gifts for both boys, and spent an hour teaching them how to build and launch paper rockets in the backyard, his clothes covered in grass stains and his face alight with genuine joy. "Okay," Letitia admitted later, watching him patiently explain to my nephew why his rocket had spun instead of soaring. "I see it now." "See what?" I asked. "The way he fits. Not just with you, but with all of us. Like he's not trying to pull you into his world. He's finding his place in yours." Our first official date wasn't what I expected either. No helicopter rides to private islands or chauffeurs in black cars. Instead, David picked me up in his sensible sedan and took me to a community garden project he volunteered with. We spent the afternoon planting seedlings alongside neighborhood kids, our hands dirty, sweat beading on our foreheads under the Georgia sun. "I wanted you to see this part of my life," he explained as we worked side by side. "This matters more to me than board meetings or investment portfolios." Afterwards, dirty and exhausted, we got ice cream from a street vendor and walked through the park as the sun set. When he finally kissed me, it was gentle, a question rather than a demand. His hands cradled my face like I was something precious, something that might break if handled too roughly. And in that moment, I realized how long it had been since I'd felt truly seen, truly valued for exactly who I was. Later that evening, sitting on my porch swing, David asked about my past. Not in a jealous way, but with genuine curiosity about what had shaped me. And I found myself telling him everything. About Deshaun's betrayal with my roommate, about the high school boyfriend who deemed me not good enough, about finding Marcus's second phone with messages to the mother of his child. "I understand why you built those walls," he said when I finished, his fingers lightly tracing patterns on my palm. "Anyone would have." "What about you?" I asked, suddenly realizing how little I knew about his romantic history. "Surely women must throw themselves at a successful, kind man like you." A shadow crossed his face. There was someone. Once. The way he said it, with such finality, made my heart ache for him. She was with me before the company took off, when we were still working out of my garage, living on ramen and hope. "What happened?" I asked gently. "When the money came, she changed. Or maybe I did. Suddenly, everything was about appearances, status, what we could buy, and who we could impress." He shook his head. "I realized one day that I didn't recognize either of us anymore. In that confession, I felt a connection deeper than attraction. Here was someone who understood loss, who knew what it meant to guard your heart, someone who valued what was real over what glittered." Weeks passed, turning into months. David became a fixture in my life. Sunday dinners with my family, quiet evenings reading together on my couch, mornings where he'd bring me coffee in bed instead of me making it for him at the shop. Somewhere along the way, my carefully maintained walls began to crumble entirely, and it terrified me. Because the more I opened myself to him, the more vulnerable I became, the more I had to lose. The nights he didn't stay over, I'd lie awake, my mind spiraling through all the ways this could end in heartbreak. What if, like all the others, he was just wearing a mask? What if I was setting myself up for an even more devastating fall? "You're waiting for the other shoe to drop," Renee observed one day over lunch. "I can see it in your eyes every time he does something sweet. Instead of just enjoying it, you're cataloging it as evidence for a future betrayal." "That's not true," I protested weakly. "Isn't it? Maya, that man is in love with you. Real, honest-to-God, write songs about it love. And you're still keeping one foot out the door." She was right, of course. Even as David and I grew closer, even as I felt myself falling for him, I kept waiting for the revelation that would prove my initial instincts right. That love wasn't for me, that men couldn't be trusted, that happiness was temporary at best. What I didn't realize was that by waiting for betrayal, I was already betraying something precious. And it would take nearly losing everything to make me see it. 6 months into our relationship, when the leaves were turning golden and the air had that first hint of autumn crispness, David asked me to accompany him to his company's annual charity gala. It would be our first major public appearance together in his world, a world of wealth and influence I still felt like an imposter in. "You don't have to come if it makes you uncomfortable," he said, seeming to read my hesitation. "These events can be pretentious, and that's not who we are." Who we are. The phrase warmed me, the casual way he linked us together as a unit. "No, I want to go," I insisted, pushing down my anxiety. "I want to see this part of your life, too." The night of the gala, David picked me up in a car that was decidedly not his usual sedan. A sleek black town car with a driver. He looked different, too. Devastatingly handsome in a tailored tuxedo that emphasized his broad shoulders. For a moment, I felt a flicker of insecurity in my midnight blue gown, wondering if I would fit into this version of his life. "You take my breath away," he said when I opened the door, his eyes holding that same warmth they had the first day in my coffee shop. And just like that, my anxiety receded. This was still David. My David. The ballroom was opulent. Crystal chandeliers, champagne fountains, people draped in designer labels and diamonds that caught the light. David kept me close, his hand a reassuring presence at the small of my back as he introduced me to colleagues and business partners. "This is Maya," he'd say, with a pride that made me stand taller. "She owns the best coffee shop in Atlanta and makes the most incredible cinnamon rolls you've ever tasted. Not my girlfriend or the woman I'm seeing, but Maya the person. Maya with her own accomplishments." The evening was going smoothly until I excused myself to the restroom. As I was touching up my lipstick, two women entered, their conversation halting briefly when they saw me before resuming in slightly hushed tones. "So that's David's latest project?" one said, eyeing me in the mirror. "She's pretty, I guess, in a simple way." "Diane says it won't last," replied the other, adjusting her diamond earrings. "Apparently, he's been looking at rings, but you know how these charity cases end. Once the novelty wears off, he'll realize she doesn't belong in this world." "I give it 6 more months," the first woman laughed. "Until then, she should enjoy the Cinderella treatment. Lord knows she'll never see this kind of luxury once he comes to his senses." My face burned as I pretended to rummage through my clutch, their words slicing through me like knives. Project, charity case, Cinderella. Was that how everyone here saw me? Was that how David saw me? As some kind of rescue mission? A novelty to be enjoyed until he tired of playing savior? I returned to the gala in a daze. The room suddenly too loud, too bright, too false. David immediately sensed something was wrong, his brow furrowing with concern. "What happened?" he asked, guiding me to a quiet corner. "Nothing," I lied, forcing a smile. "Just feeling a little overwhelmed?" He studied my face, not believing me, but not pushing either. "We can leave whenever you want. Just say the word." I nodded, but as the evening progressed, those women's words kept echoing in my head, joining all the doubts and fears I'd been harboring. Every interaction I witnessed now seemed suspect. Was that business partner giving me a pitying look? Was that woman whispering about the coffee shop owner who had somehow snagged Atlanta's most eligible bachelor? By the time we left, the walls I had so carefully dismantled were rapidly rebuilding themselves, brick by anxious brick. In the car ride home, David tried to reach for my hand, but I pulled away, creating physical distance to match the emotional chasm that was widening inside me. "Maya, please tell me what's wrong," he said quietly. "Whatever it is, we can fix it together." "Can we?" I asked, my voice tight with unshed tears. "Can we really fix the fact that I don't belong in your world? That to your friends, I'm just some curiosity you'll eventually tire of?" His face registered shock, then hurt. "Who said that to you? That's not true, Maya. Not even close." "But it is true," I insisted, all my insecurities pouring out now. "We've been playing pretend, David. Acting like our worlds aren't completely different, like this relationship isn't doomed from the start." "The only one saying it's doomed is you," he countered, frustration edging into his voice. "From day one, you've been waiting for this to fail, looking for reasons why it can't work." "Because it can't," I exclaimed, tears finally spilling over. "Men like you don't end up with women like me. Not for real, not for keeps." "Men like me," he repeated, his voice dangerously quiet. "You mean men with money? Is that all I am to you, Maya? A bank account? A stereotype?" The hurt in his eyes pierced me, but I couldn't stop the spiral of fear and doubt. "That's not what I meant." "Then what did you mean?" he challenged. "Because it sounds like you've already decided who I am and what I want without actually asking me." We reached my apartment in tense silence. When David tried to walk me to my door, I stopped him. "I think we need some space," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "This is moving too fast." Something in his expression shuddered, a light going dim. "Space," he repeated flatly. "After 6 months, you still need space." "Yes," I affirmed, even as everything in me screamed to take it back. He nodded once, stepping away. Call me when you decide if you actually want to be in this relationship, Maya, because I can't keep proving myself to someone who's determined not to believe in us. I watched him drive away, then collapsed against my front door, sobbing. I'd done it again. Pushed away someone who cared about me before they could hurt me first. Only this time, it didn't feel like protection. It felt like self-destruction. The next week was agony. I threw myself into work, avoided calls from Renee and Letitia, and tried not to check my phone every 5 minutes for a message from David. Pride and fear kept me from reaching out, even as I missed him with a physical ache I hadn't expected. Then, on the 8th day of our separation, Mr. Wilson appeared at my shop, newspaper tucked under his arm as usual. "You look terrible," he observed bluntly, settling into his regular chair. "Thanks," I replied dryly, sliding his usual Earl Grey across the counter. "That nice young man of yours hasn't been by," he continued, watching me carefully. "The one who always saves me the business section, even though I can tell he wants to read it himself." I swallowed hard. "We're taking a break." Mr. Wilson nodded sagely. "Ah, yes, taking a break. That's what my Eleanor said to me back in 1962. Know what I did? Let her go. Biggest mistake of my life." He sipped his tea, eyes never leaving my face. "Took me 30 years to find her again. 30 years wasted because I was too proud and too scared to fight for what mattered." "It's different," I protested weakly. "David and I are too different. His world is—" "Oh, spare me," Mr. Wilson interrupted. "Worlds, classes, money, all excuses people use when they're afraid of the real thing." He tapped his newspaper. "Did you know your young man is in here today? Page 6. My heart stuttered as I took the paper, flipping frantically until I found the small article. Tech CEO David Winters establishes scholarship fund for minority business owners. The accompanying photo showed David at the gala, looking handsome but somehow hollow, his smile not reaching his eyes. "The fund is named after his grandmother," Mr. Wilson added quietly. "And yours." I stared at the paper, vision blurring with tears as I read the details. The Eliza Johnson Margaret Winters Entrepreneurship Fund, designed to help women of color start their own businesses. Named after both our grandmothers, something he must have been planning for months. "He came by yesterday," Mr. Wilson continued, his voice gentle now. "Just to check if an old man was doing okay without his Sunday paper companion. Looked about as bad as you do. Asked about you, though he tried to be casual about it." He stood, patting my hand. "Life's too short for what-ifs, my dear. Believe me, I know." After he left, I sat in stunned silence, the newspaper clutched in my hands. In my rush to protect myself from potential heartbreak, I'd caused real heartbreak instead. I'd let the ghosts of past betrayals convince me that history was destined to repeat itself, when all evidence pointed to the contrary. David hadn't been loving me conditionally. I had. That night, as I lay awake staring at the ceiling, my phone buzzed with a text. From David. Just 2 words that broke the dam inside me. "Still awake?" I stared at those 2 words on my phone screen, my heart hammering against my ribs. Still awake? Such a simple question carrying the weight of everything unsaid between us. My fingers hovered over the keyboard, trembling slightly as I typed back, "Yes. Can't sleep." 3 dots appeared immediately, then disappeared, then appeared again. He was wrestling with words too. Finally, "My apartment feels empty without you reading in the corner of my couch." Tears welled in my eyes. I could picture that corner perfectly. The soft throw pillow, the warm lamplight, the way he'd glance up from his own book every so often just to look at me, like he couldn't quite believe I was there. I had felt so at home in that space. So safe. "Can we talk?" I typed. Not by text, in person. I'll come to you, he responded instantly. 15 minutes. Those 15 minutes were the longest of my life. I paced my small living room, rehearsing what to say, how to explain the storm of fear and doubt that had driven me to push him away. When the soft knock finally came, I nearly jumped out of my skin. David stood on my porch, his hair slightly rumpled like he'd been running his hands through it. A nervous habit I'd come to recognize. He wore a simple t-shirt and jeans, dark circles under his eyes matching my own. No carefully constructed image, no walls, just David. My David. "Hi," he said softly. "Hi," I echoed, stepping back to let him in. We stood in my living room, the space between us charged with all the things we needed to say. Neither of us seemed to know how to start. "I saw the newspaper," I finally blurted out. "The scholarship fund, named after our grandmothers." He nodded, hands shoved in his pockets. "I've been working on it for months. Wanted to surprise you at the gala, but then—" He trailed off, pain flashing across his features. "I'm so sorry," I whispered, the words entirely inadequate for the hurt I'd caused. What those women said at the gala, it triggered every insecurity, every fear I've ever had about relationships, about not being enough. "What women?" he asked, confusion crossing his face. I told him about the conversation I'd overheard in the bathroom, how it had unraveled everything I thought I knew about us. As I spoke, his expression darkened. "Those were Elise's friends," he said when I finished. "My ex, the one I told you about." He ran a hand through his hair again, confirming my earlier observation. "Maya, they don't know me. They don't know us. They're part of a world I've been trying to distance myself from for years." "But they're right, aren't they?" I pressed, needing to face this fear head-on. "We are from different worlds. You're a millionaire tech CEO, and I'm just—" "Just what?" he interrupted, taking a step closer. "Just the most incredible woman I've ever met? Just the person who makes me feel like I matter for who I am, not what I own? Just the first person since my grandmother died who makes me feel like I have a home?" His words wrapped around my heart, but the doubt still lingered. "David, I own a coffee shop. I live in a tiny apartment. I can't give you—" "Stop," he said firmly, closing the distance between us to take my hands in his. "I need you to hear me, really hear me. I don't want what you can give me. I want you. The woman who works 16-hour days to make her dream come true. The woman who remembers every regular's order and asks about their kids. The woman who made me want to be better, to do more with what I have." He took a deep breath, his eyes never leaving mine. "Before I met you, I had money, success, everything society says should make you happy. And I was lonely, so damn lonely. The day I spilled coffee all over your floor was the luckiest day of my life, Maya, because it led me to you." Tears streamed down my face now, unchecked. "I'm scared," I admitted, finally voicing the truth at the core of everything. "I'm scared because I love you so much, and loving someone means giving them the power to destroy you." "I love you too," he said, his voice breaking on the words. "And yes, love is terrifying. It's putting your heart in someone else's hands and trusting them not to crush it. But Maya, the alternative is worse. Living behind walls, never letting anyone close enough to hurt you, that's not protection. It's prison." I knew he was right. In trying to guard myself against pain, I'd been denying myself joy, connection, growth, all the things that make life worth living. "When Marcus betrayed me," I said slowly, working it out as I spoke, "I didn't just lose him. I lost faith in my own judgment, in my worth. I convinced myself I didn't deserve real love, so I stopped looking for it." David nodded, understanding in his eyes. "And when Elise changed after the money came, I decided relationships were conditional, that people only stayed as long as you had something they wanted. He brushed a tear from my cheek with his thumb. We've both been hiding, Maya. Me behind my work, you behind your walls. So what do we do now? I asked, leaning into his touch. We stop hiding, he said simply. We acknowledge that yes, love is a risk. Yes, we might get hurt, but we choose to be brave anyway, because what we have is worth fighting for. I thought about all the moments over the past 6 months, his patient kindness, his genuine interest in my life and dreams, the way he fit so seamlessly into my world while inviting me into his. I thought about how different he was from anyone I'd known before, not because of his wealth, but because of his heart. I want to be brave with you, I whispered, wrapping my arms around his neck. I want to build something real, even if it's scary. His smile was like sunrise breaking through clouds. That's all I've ever wanted. When he kissed me then, it felt like coming home and setting out on an adventure all at once, like ending one chapter and beginning another, more beautiful one. The next morning, I woke to find David making coffee in my kitchen, humming softly to himself. Watching him move through my space with such comfortable familiarity, I felt a peace I hadn't known in years. The walls I had built so carefully were truly gone now, replaced by something stronger. Trust built on choice rather than fear. "What are you thinking about?" he asked, noticing me watching him from the doorway. "That I've been wrong about love," I replied, accepting the mug he offered. "I thought it was something that happened to you, something you fell into and couldn't control. But it's a choice. Every day we choose each other. Even when it's hard. Even when we're scared." He smiled, pulling me close. Especially then. 6 months later, David asked me to marry him. Not with a grand gesture or an extravagant ring, but on a quiet Sunday morning in our coffee shop, before we opened for the day. Just the two of us, sunlight streaming through the windows, the scent of fresh coffee in the air. "This is where it all began," he said, kneeling beside the spot where he'd spilled his coffee that first day. "And I want to spend the rest of my life building on that beginning." I said yes through happy tears, knowing with absolute certainty that this was right, that he was right, that we were right together. 2 years have passed since that rainy Tuesday when David Winters walked into my shop and changed everything. We're married now, living in a house we chose together. Not a mansion, not my tiny apartment, but something that's perfectly us. Beans and Dreams has expanded to 3 locations across Atlanta, with a program that trains and employs women rebuilding their lives after hardship. The Eliza Johnson Margaret Winters Entrepreneurship Fund has helped 17 women start their own businesses so far. David still runs his company, but with a renewed focus on community impact. And I still make him coffee every morning, though now I know exactly how he likes it. Black with just the tiniest bit of cinnamon, a taste he developed because of me. We're not perfect. We still argue sometimes. We still have moments of doubt and fear. But we face them together, choosing each other again and again, day after day. So that's my story. How a Black woman who swore off love found herself loved by a man who saw her walls not as obstacles, but as parts of the beautiful, complex person he cherished. How I learned that sometimes the greatest act of courage isn't keeping people out, but letting them in. They say when you stop looking for love, that's when you find it. But I think the truth is more complicated. I think sometimes love finds you precisely when you've convinced yourself you don't need it. When you're strong enough on your own to recognize real love when it appears. Not as a rescue, not as completion, but as partnership, as growth, as home. For years, I believed my grandmother's words about planting seeds for the future only applied to business, to tangible dreams you could hold in your hands. Now I understand she meant all dreams, even the ones your heart is afraid to whisper. Even love, especially love. If you've ever closed your heart to love, share this video with someone who needs to hear that sometimes the most beautiful beginnings come after we've given up. Don't forget to subscribe for more stories that will remind you that love isn't just for fairy tales. It's for real people like us. For people who've been hurt. For people who are afraid. For people brave enough to try again. Because that's the thing about walls. They don't just keep others out. They keep you in. And beyond those walls, that's where life happens. That's where love grows. That's where you find the courage to believe again.